to start. I've numbered the slides where possible, so feel free to go ahead and ask questions in the chat, but I don't usually see the chat while I'm talking. So if you're referring to a specific image that you see on the screen that you want me to comment on in the Q&A at the end of my talk, please just say, you know, slide number 23, and I'll go back and just check what you're talking about. Because what's that doesn't help when I have a whole bunch of images going on. So with that little logistical piece, I think we can get started. So if there's one book in the canon that was used by every Jew, young and old, male and female, in the pre-modern era, it was the Haggadah. As the critical guide to the Passover seder, everyone needed a Haggadah in some form, and its styles ranged from the simplest forms, hastily written on cheap paper, to the ostentatiously lavish. I should begin by warning you that a comprehensive history of the Haggadah would take us far longer than the time I have allotted, so please consider this just a small taste of the many different Haggadot that have been created across the centuries. The very first Haggadot that exists today were found in the Cairo Geniza. A Geniza is a place where Jews deposit what is sometimes known as shemus, sacred texts that are no longer fit for use due to damage. In some communities, these materials are buried, but in others, they were put into special storage areas. The Geniza in the Ben Ezra synagogue in Old Cairo, also known as Fustat, contained manuscripts covering over 1,000 years, including works in the hand of the famed scholar Maimonides. The Cairo Geniza was discovered, and I put that in quotes because it's a very complicated story, by Western scholars in the 18th century, in a story that would have inspired Indiana Jones. A good popular overview of the story there, of the Geniza, is Sacred Trash, the lost and found world of the Cairo Geniza. And I think I have that link to put in the chat to that title. The text for this Geniza for this Haggadah, follows the Palestinian rite, as described in the Talmud Yerushalmi, including a question that would not be found in most of today's Haggadot. And I quote, "On all other nights, we eat meat that is roasted or cooked." And here I have circled the word sli, which means roasted. But on this night, we eat only roasted meat. This goes in direct contradiction to the traditional view held today, which is based on the Babylonian Talmud, that one may not have roasted meat at the Seder. But perhaps like the great Kitniot debate today, there was much discussion over whether or not to eat roasted meat in the 10th century. Halper 211, and that's the call number and how it's known to scholars, has been well known to scholars for years. But a project begun at the University of Pennsylvania in the last few years has uncovered additional Haggadah material. The scribes of the Cairo Geniza project, and I'll ask to put that link in the chat, which has partnered with crowdsourcing giant Zooniverse to identify and transcribe hundreds of thousands of manuscripts in the Cairo Geniza, has identified another Haggadah, this one with Judeo-Arabic instructions and beautiful red color on each page. The Scribes Project actually produced a Haggadah in 2018 based solely on Geniza fragments, which is available in partnership with Sefaria.org. And we'll put that link in the chat as well. That's a medium.com link. Before we get to the glorious medieval illuminated Haggadot, I want to point out that the famous ones that you may have heard of, the Bird's Head Haggadah, the Golden Haggadah, and others that you'll see today, were exclusive productions for the very wealthy. Parchment was incredibly expensive to make, often involving dozens of animals, and few could afford the gold leaf that often seems standard for these Haggadot. It is hard to know what the Hamon Am, or the average person, might have used, as inferior materials that the average person might be able to afford, like paper and inferior inks, were more likely to deteriorate and thus not survive. It is with this in mind that perhaps we can appreciate this Haggadah, written on a roll of paper in the 11th century. It is not clear when the back of the Haggadah was used to write a letter about an uprising in Alexandria, but this particular Haggadah was meant solely for function, not for its aesthetics, and not with the intent to last for more than perhaps one Seder. And here I have to thank Professor Eve Krakowski, who alerted me to this wonderful Haggadah. This Mahzor from 14th century France was certainly not commissioned by a poor person, so it's a prayer book for the holidays. Since, again, parchment was incredibly expensive, and one had to hire a scribe to write the texts. But it is made from less than perfect quality materials, and it's quite possible that it was the only book in its owner's possession. It is a mahzor for Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. And so someone who could afford to hire a scribe and to purchase parchment for only one book might choose to commission a piece like this for use all year round. The parchment throughout the mahzor is patched or cut apart in places. And then there are some embellishments of the letters. There's no colored ink or gold to be found inside. Interestingly, I did find some leaves from a Yiddish printed book inside, but that would have been from a later owner after the advent of print. Now let's turn to some Haggadot that are a bit more colorful. The amount of extant illuminated Haggadot is quite astounding, considering how relatively few Hebrew manuscripts survived to the modern period. But they were clearly viewed as treasures by all who held them, and so we're lucky enough to be able to see them today, even if just digitally. I should point out that the majority of the Haggadot I will show today can be found in their entirety on the websites of their respective repositories, or in Ktiv, the International Database of Hebrew Manuscripts, which is hosted by the National Library of Israel, and I'll ask for a link for that to be put in the chat as well. I'll start with the Prado Haggadah, held today at the Jewish Theological Seminary. The Prado is unique because it was a Haggadah that was begun but not completed, so it is an incredible exemplar of the process of medieval illumination. The parchment and ruling patterns, that is, the lines made by the scribe for writing in a straight line, of the Prado Haggadah are Sephardic, but the text itself includes some Ashkenazic liturgy. It is dated to approximately 1300. As you can see, the decorator, who is often different than the scribe, spent different amounts of time on different pages. 30 of the manuscript pages leaves are complete, but 58 more are in various stages of incompleteness. And you see down to barely anything, some gold here and some blue. We know that the manuscript was in Italy by 1617, but little else is known about its history before the modern period. If you look at the images, you can see the order in which a medieval manuscript was decorated. The first step was putting bole on the manuscript, and that's this orangey thing. Bole was the base upon which gold leaf would be painted to give it texture, and gold leaf often is lifted up a bit over the page. Then the gold leaf was added, followed by the lapis, which was used for the blue color. The colors were added to the manuscript in decreasing order of cost to minimize mistakes and financial loss. In 2017, curators at the Jewish Theological Seminary asked Barbara Wolf, a modern book illuminator, to illustrate images of the Haggadah in the way that a scribe may have intended to complete it. Using inks, paints, and materials that would have been used in the 15th century, Barbara Wolf produced a complete edition of this Haggadah. One example page can be seen here. And no, she did not color on the original manuscript. This was a separate production. Let's turn to a few other well-known Haggadot. This one is incredibly lavish in its decoration, the polar opposite of what we saw with the Prado. Its title page, though, is deceiving, implying that it was created in the 17th century. The text of the title page describes how Yoav Galiko of Asti gave it to his son-in-law as a wedding gift in 1602. But the title page was created well after the original Haggadah was written and decorated. The creation of title pages, even those that were hand-drawn, only began with the era of print. The book inside, however, is much older. It begins with a style familiar to many Iberian manuscripts, the biblical story cycle. And we see here Abraham sacrificing Isaac. We see the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. We see Jacob's dream with the angels going up and down the ladder, and the blessing by Isaac of Jacob, and there's Esau in the background. Drawn in a series of panels, much like a comic book, each square shows a different element of the Bible story. Here, we also see the extensive bold that gives this Haggadah its name. A personal note about the owner of this Haggadah: The Golden Haggadah came to the British Library from the collection of Giuseppe Almanzi, a 19th century book collector in Padua. His collection was sold in two parts in the 1860s by a book dealer in Amsterdam named Frederick Muller. The first part was purchased by the British Library and included many manuscripts, including the Golden Haggadah. The second part of this collection, with mostly early printed books, ended up being purchased by Temple Emmanuel in New York, who ultimately presented the library to Columbia University, where I'm the curator for Judaica. So I view this particular manuscript as sort of the one that got away. Another Haggadah produced in the same context of the Golden Haggadah, but perhaps with a little less gold, is this one, known for its current location at the National Museum of Bosnia and Herzegovina as the Sarajevo Haggadah. Like its golden counterpart, the Sarajevo Haggadah begins with a cycle of panels with stories from the Bible, ending with images of a family celebrating the seder. And that's the Baal Habayit, the person in charge of the house, giving out the matzah to everybody at his seder. In a more modern context, and here we have, the plagues of lice and wild animals, respectively. And they apparently had dragon-like creatures in Egypt. Who knew? In a more modern context, the Sarajevo Haggadah was one of the first to be written about in the context of modern art history, when Julius von Schlosser and David Heinrich Müller published it in 1898 as Die Sarajevo Haggadah, eine Spanisch-Jüdische Bilderhandschrift des Mittelalters. And that was sort of a critical edition with commentary about the art. But that only scratches the surface of the amazing story of this book. This Haggadah was made in Barcelona in the mid-14th century, although it seems to also have some Italian elements as well. It likely left Spain with the expulsion of the Jews from these lands in 1492. It next appeared in Italy in the 17th century, as we see from the signature of church censor Giovanni Domenico Vistorini in 1609. And as the story goes, it was sold to the National Museum of Sarajevo for 150 crowns after a child brought it to school to sell it following his father's death. The Haggadah then survived 2 wars and at least 1 additional theft attempt. The library's director, Joseph Petrovic, and its curator, Dervis Korkut, risked their lives to hide the Haggadah in a mosque in the village of Mount Jalasnica during World War II, so that it wouldn't be stolen or destroyed by the Nazis. And then it was hidden in an underground vault after it escaped a second near destruction during the heavy shelling of the museum during the Yugoslavian Civil War. It was proclaimed a movable national monument by Bosnia and Herzegovina in 2003, and it was registered by UNESCO in the Memory of the World Register in 2017. And of course, some of you may be familiar with it from the story made famous by Geraldine Brooks's novel, The People in the Book. And there's a link to that book going in the chat as well. Both Jews and non-Jews were hired to illustrate Hebrew manuscripts. The most famous Jewish manuscript illuminator was Yoel ben Shimon, also known as Feibush Ashkenazi, who worked in Germany and Italy in the second half of the 15th century. He's known for having illuminated 11 extant manuscripts, of which 6 are Haggadot. The first of his Haggadot is at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and it was completed in 1454. The second, produced in 1478, is known as the Washington Haggadah, and is now at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. And you can sort of see what a difference 20 years makes, where he starts off in sort of muted colors, with the exception of the image on the lower right, and then gets a lot more vibrant as he perfects his trade. The Darmstadt Haggadah is a particular favorite of mine. Written in Germany, likely in the 1430s to 1450s by Israel ben Meir of Heidelberg, it is particularly notable for this detailed scene of women studying, both with each other and with men. Due to the many pictures of women throughout the Haggadah, scholars believe that it was probably made for a woman. It appears that the scribal arts ran in Israel ben Meir's family. His son, Meir ben Yisrael, decorated what is now known as the first Cincinnati Haggadah, currently at Hebrew Union College. And I should note that this border is later, and that's why it may look a little bit jarring because it does not at all fit with the style of the rest of the image. This manuscript is also of German design, although probably from much later in the century, most likely the 1480s or 1490s. Interestingly, the scribe of this manuscript is also known as a bookbinder. Yisrael ben Meir's name is mentioned in a decree in Nuremberg in 1468, giving him permission to dwell in that city. This manuscript was owned by a woman named Teublin, the daughter of Rabbi Sachar, in 1559, before it was given by Leah, the daughter of Rabbi Moses, to her son-in-law Abraham. And that's what these inscriptions here. This is Teublin, and this is Leah, indicating where the manuscript went. Again, not all Haggadot were standalone luxury items with gold leaf and colorful illustrations. A Haggadah could also appear in a Mahzor, as we saw earlier, and as it does here in the 15th century. This is a prayer book for the Roman Rite. Here we see the beginning of Magid and the section of the poor man's bread, as well as a visual reminder in Hallel to include a section often left out during that prayer throughout the year. This hand, called a manicule, appeared in many different manuscripts and was the equivalent of an underline or a sticky note, marking an important place in modern books. Here's another more embellished one from the same manuscript. In the 15th century, of course, a new technology was sweeping through Europe, where it was embraced almost immediately by Jewish communities. Although Jews were not allowed to join the guilds in Germany and thus could not print there in the 15th century, Hebrew printing began within 15 years of Gutenberg's first Bible, and it flourished in Spain and Portugal before the Jews were expelled from there in 1492 and 1497, respectively. And it also flourished in Italy. The very first example that we have of a printed Haggadah was probably printed in Guadalajara in Spain around 1482. There is one known copy in existence at the National Library of Israel. Although, in the 1980s, two newly found copies mysteriously appeared on the market in quick succession. If just one had appeared, it would have been very exciting, but two was a bit suspicious. After some investigation, it was found that a former Catholic abbot who had converted to Judaism named Raphael Podi had used 15th century paper to create excellent forgeries of the copy in Jerusalem. The clue that revealed the forgery was that the copy was too exact. Pade had copied the wormholes from the Jerusalem copy onto the new version he had created. Wormholes, of course, are unique to every book, depending on where bookworms choose to find a snack. If you've heard of any Hebrew printer from the incunable era, that is, the time prior to 1501, in which printers were just beginning to experiment with the new technology of movable type, then you've probably heard of the Soncino press. The Soncinos were a multi-generational family of printers who began in the Milanian town of Soncino in Italy and traveled throughout Italy and the Ottoman Empire before finally settling in Constantinople. Joshua Solomon Soncino, the patriarch of the family, printed two Sidurim in Soncino in 1486. The first is now known as the Sidurello. It is a small format sitter at the end of which was bound a small Haggadah. Only two of these smaller Haggadot survive in public collections today, those of the British Library and the Jewish Theological Seminary. By the end of the same year, Soncino had also completed the printed of a large format Mahzor of the Roman Rite, which included the Haggadah as part of the services. Note that Soncino carved a new matzah woodcut for this one. And I'll just go back so you could see the comparison where it says matzah over here, and then this one for the part talking about the matzah. Also, and we see here the limitations of the digital. This book is probably twice the size of this one, if not larger, which you just can't tell by looking at flat digital images. The earliest extant printed Haggadah that includes illustrations, unfortunately, survives in only 8 leaves at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Fortunate that it survives at all, I should say. Based on the typeface, it was probably produced by printers from Spain or Portugal. either before they were expelled from those lands or after they fled, probably to the Ottoman Empire based on the journey of the Iberian printers that we do know who ended up in Constantinople. With the advent of print came beautiful innovations in Haggadah production. Beautiful Haggadot could be created en masse, and they were very successful. A Haggadah printed at Prague in 1526 included what I tend to call Hebrew Gothic fonts, and that's based on the Ashkenazic hand, and it's very heavy and square, sort of in the way that that actual Gothic fonts are a heavier font. In somewhat of a throwback to the manuscript era, the printer justified the lines by adding letters from words meant to go on the next line. And if you read Hebrew, you can see here where it says Kadesh and then Kachenu, because they started the word Kachenu, or the Hey and then the word Halvana, because they wanted this all to be justified. I want to point in another holdover to the manuscript era in the embellishments of the word tam here. And this, to me, when I first looked at it, almost looked like pencil illustrations. But no, it exists in all Prague Haggadah copies. And so that was actually carved on a block of wood, including with the rabbits, in order to create that illustration. The Prague Haggadah was very influential in later Haggadah creation as well. A Haggadah printed in Mantua in 1560 started off with the typical Italian typeface, as you can see here, which is much more similar to what we might be familiar with today. But its printers decided not to mess with success when it came to the Haggadah itself, even though the thicker typeface was not typical for Italian presses. In circumstances vaguely reminiscent of our own history, the printer Colonimus ben Mordechai Yaffe was unable to print his edition of the Zevach Pesach, which was a Haggadah with the commentary of Isaac Abarbanel, in Lublin, which is where his press was, because of a plague ravaging that city in 1592. Instead, he fled to nearby Bistrouis, where he safely printed his volume. This is actually the only book known to have been printed in Bistrouis. It is impossible to talk about early modern printed Haggadot without mentioning the one printed in Amsterdam in 1695. It was the first Haggadah to use copper plates rather than woodcuts, so its illustrations could be exquisitely detailed, as you can see here with the plague of frogs. It was a bestseller, with its illustrations copied multiple times over the years. Its printers knew their audiences, and I use the plural intentionally because they printed both a Sephardic and an Ashkenazic version of the Birkat Hamazon at the end of the seder in their Haggadah. The fold-out map of the Holy Land at the end of the Amsterdam Haggadah is the first of its kind ever printed in Hebrew. And I should point out that it's the land of Israel on its side. So here's the Mediterranean Sea, which may be why it looks a bit confusing. It's on the bottom. The era of printing, however, did not cease all manuscript production. And as a reminder, manuscript comes from the word manu, which means hand in Latin, and script is writing. So these are works, we're going to talk for a minute about works written rather than printed. Like pressing a hit song on vinyl as an exclusive nod to the past, 18th century Jewish artists perfected the scribal arts for luxury books. But this time, they were meant to look exactly like a printed book. Our own Wolf Herlingen was a master of this genre. His Haggadah of 1725, now in the Brzezinski collection in Zurich, shows exquisite lettering and glorious images of contemporary Jews celebrating the Passover Seder. And so here you see the order of the Seder and what the family is doing at each one. So here's Yachatz, the breaking of the matzah, Magid, where they're telling the story, and also I see pouring some wine. Here they're washing their hands for the second washing of the hands, eating the festival meal. Each frame has them doing something different. Another Haggadah of his from 1730 is barely distinguishable from print in its beautifully executed design. So again, this Haggadah, although it looks like it's printed, is actually written by hand. But of course, all Jews needed Haggadot, not just those who were wealthy enough to afford lavishly decorated ones. This book is a miscellany written by, quote, the youth, Raphael Chaim Malach, in Casale, in what is now Italy, in 1783. Toward the end of the book, Raphael included instructions for the Pesach Seder in Italian and in Hebrew. Here you have instructions for the Kiddush, including what to do if the Seder falls on Shabbat, as it does this year. A few pages later begins Magid, and Raphael noted the importance of telling the story of the Exodus during this portion of the Seder. A couple of decades later, and halfway across the world, this Haggadah was written in Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic. The title page notes that it is mine, the thief should be destroyed, and the reader will rejoice in the merit of Abraham, son of Terah. The signature at the bottom announces ownership by Eliyahu Avod Hatzair, also known as the Young One. So a lot of people seem to have been making their own personal Haggadot. Not dissimilar, I think, to what some young people do today in schools when they make their own Haggadot in preparation for the Seder. Eliyahu also included drawings of the matzah in his Haggadah, and this one is labeled as the Kohen, which in the order of the matzot, the three matzahs are sometimes called Kohen, Levi, and Yisrael. So that would be the top matzah. I'll end with one of my favorite manuscripts in Columbia's collection from the 18th century. This one is from the Comtat-Venaissin region in the south of France. Although the Jews were expelled from France in 1390 and were not formally allowed back in until after the French Revolution, one area in France had a continuing Jewish presence. The Comtat-Venaissin region of France includes Avignon and its surrounding areas, including Carpentras, Cavaillon, and L'Isle-sur-la-Sorgue. And forgive me if I'm destroying the French here. It was under the jurisdiction of the Pope. Similar to Rome, where the Pope protected the Jews, so a remainder would survive to see the errors of their ways at the second coming of Jesus, the Pope also protected the Jews of the Comtat, and they were thus able to preserve their distinctive prayers and customs until the French Revolution. The four cities named above were known as the four holy cities among French Jews, and the oldest existing synagogue in France is also in this area, and you can still see it today. These illustrations of the three cardinal aspects of the Seder, the Paschal lamb, quite a tiny one here in the little bowl, the matzah, and the maror, are truly lovely. But what I think is fantastic about this manuscript comes a few pages later at Shulchan Aruch, the Seder meal. And when looking at this one, it appears that they didn't have the same rule that I had in my house growing up, where when we turned to the Seder meal, we had to take our Haggadot off the table. It appears that they ate over their Haggadah. The Haggadah has always been a very special book for the Jewish people. Because of its small size, it could be embellished, and the stories within lead to wonderful decorations. In the modern era, Haggadot can be found in all colors and sizes, and media. Dozens of new Haggadot appear on the market every year, some with brand new commentaries, some tracing the thoughts of a scholar from long ago. The sampling I've showed you today only scratches the surface of what has been produced in the past, and we can look forward to what glorious designs and also wine stains will be produced in the future. Thank you.
Okay, it looks like we have some time for questions. Let me see if I can find the first one. Do we know when, where, and why did the earliest Haggadot were produced? And so asking when and why and where the earliest Haggadot were produced and became a part of Jewish life.
So the discussion of using a Haggadah appears in the Mishnah. So that would be the Mishnah was codified, I think, in the 3rd or 4th century of the Common Era. Prior to that, there was always a law to tell the story of the coming out of Egypt. How that was done in the ancient period, we don't know. But in the Mishnah in Pesachim, I think it's chapter 10, it talks about exactly what should be discussed in the Haggadah. So that's where this is coming from, the Haggadah as we know it. This concept of telling the story of coming out of Egypt is biblical. That comes out of, that's in the Bible, and it's discussed around discussing the holiday of Passover.
Could you tell us more about the writing of the text of the Haggadah?
So do you mean how it was written technically, or how those texts were chosen? And that's Pepita Capriolo, if you want to maybe unmute.
Pepita cannot unmute, but
okay.
if she wants to post kind of more elaboration on that question in the chat,
yeah,
totally.
Sure.
This might be a related question though. Was it passed down orally originally? Who memorized it?
That is a fabulous question. I don't know, and I want to say that again because it's a Mishnaic injunction. So the Haggadah was codified as the Haggadah as we know it in the Mishnah. We don't have enough information to know whether those were the exact words that were used prior to the time of the Mishnah. So it may have been more of an oral telling of the story. And I think what a lot of people, how people like to describe it is there's the story with the rabbis who were telling the story of the Exodus until morning. So in that case, they were telling whatever they wanted. They obviously, it doesn't take till the morning just to read through the text of the Haggadah. So there could be much more that's added in. And so it's not clear, when this particular text, as far as I know, was written. The bird's head Haggadah is indeed one of the most famous. It's famous because of the use of birds' heads rather than human heads. For people, and it was produced in Germany in the lands of Ashkenaz, and the way that scholars and art historians describe it is that the reason that birds' heads were used was because of the injunction against creating a human form, which may have been more strict in Ashkenaz than it was in Sephardic lands. That being said, we have plenty of Ashkenazic hagadot that include human forms and human heads. So it's not clear, to me at least, what that story was. What's really interesting about the bird's head Haggadah is that the birds actually wear the medieval Jews' hat. So we know very clearly what that looked like, and we know who the Jews are and who the Egyptians are, because the Jews, as depicted, are wearing the yellow hat that the Jews were required to wear in the medieval period in Central Europe at that time. Details of the illustrator of the Amsterdam Haggadah. So I don't know the name of the illustrator. Somebody mentions Bar Yaakov. I don't know if that's the name of the illustrator himself. An earlier map. This is the earliest map produced by Jews. So perhaps the person who wrote that can it was somebody wrote directly to me that an earlier map was found. I'd be curious to know if that was actually produced by Jews or by Christians. There was a large, genre of Holy Land maps and of map making during that period. But I don't know if that was actually produced. If the earlier map that you mentioned was produced by a Jew, and if so, I'd love to hear about it. Any resources for reproductions for sale? This is something that I love to hear about. I actually just bought my present for my own Passover was a copy of the Sarajevo Haggadah. But so you can often find them. Depending on how much you want to spend, you can spend anywhere from $50 for a photocopy to thousands and thousands of dollars for a perfect reproduction, on vellum with gold leaf, and a company that's well known for doing that is Facsimile Editions, and they specialize in Hebrew illuminated manuscripts. And if you search for their website, you can find some amazing reproductions. I happen to have bought mine from Mizrahi Books, which is a used book dealer in Brooklyn, but I'm sure you can find them at your. Some are sold by General Judaica dealers. I live in the New York area, so Westside Judaica had a copy of the Ashkenazi Haggadah, which I purchased a few years ago. It just depends. But I think most used book dealers are probably more likely to have them because they don't come out every year. So they're not going to show up in your regular Judaica store. Or they might, depending on what kinds of materials your Judaica store carries. But you can find a lot of them online as well. And again, cost varies tremendously. I keep saying that my favorite Haggadah is the Darmstadt Haggadah. And there's a beautiful reproduction that last I saw was $700, which is unfortunately out of my price range. But if you're able to get it, more power to you and enjoy it, because it's an amazing Haggadah. Are there Haggadot written in early America? That's an excellent question. I don't know, but I want to say yes, because any prayer book, most prayer books that included prayers for the holidays, as I showed with some of the early manuscripts, included the text of the Haggadah. So I don't know exact dates for when the first Haggadah was printed in America. Obviously, within the last 50, 75, 100 years, there have been quite a few, most notably the Maxwell House one, and many, many more. But you'll find Haggadot in prayer books as well. So they could be pretty early. Let's see. I did not mention the Venice Haggadah of 1609, but yes, also beautiful. And a lot with Hebrew, with Judeo-Italian. That's why I chose the manuscript from Columbia with the Judeo-Italian, because I think it's really important to keep in mind that the Haggadot that you might use at your Seder today may have Hebrew and English. But remember that Jews lived all over the world. And so their Haggadot could include Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic, or Hebrew and Aramaic, or Hebrew and Judeo-Italian, as in the case here. Under the gold in the illuminated manuscript is called bole, B-O-L-E. It's a kind of pigment, I guess, that they would put under it, and it lifted it up a little bit. So if you look at a physical, even some of the images will show it. It looks like there's texture. It looks like the gold is slightly lifted, that if you put your hand over it, there would be sort of a bump over the Haggadah. Do you see kids doing the 4 questions often in the prints? Not as much as you might expect. What you do see, and I didn't actually show any examples here, are the 4 sons. The 4 sons are fascinating examples of sort of contemporary culture throughout whatever the period was. So you see especially the wicked son. So what did people think wicked meant? And the Amsterdam Haggadah, I believe, if I'm not misremembering, shows a soldier. The Prague Haggadah shows a soldier, because that was sort of the worst thing that many of these Jews living, especially in Western Europe, could imagine that their child would become. Obviously, as time went on, you see different kinds of different things and different ways of describing the 4 sons. There are some contemporary ones that are also fabulous as well. And I think that's it for questions. Was there anyone else? Oh, that's a great recommendation. A Different Night by Noam Sion has many pictures of the 4 sons. There's been a lot of different examples of pictures of the 4 sons, and they're wonderful and fantastic and sometimes shocking. And the oldest one that I showed you was from the 10th century, so the 900s, and that was found in the Cairo Geniza. We don't have a famous contemporary Haggadah. So a few, the one that shows up quite a lot that you may have heard of is, so the Agam Haggadah actually is a beautiful contemporary illustrated Haggadah that I see as somebody who collects Judaica for my university. I see that appear for sale all over the place. It's beautiful. It's very large. But another one that I didn't show, and I encourage you to look for it, is the Schick Haggadah, and I'm just going to put his last name, Arthur Schick, because it's spelled in a way that you might not expect. And Arthur Schick was an illuminator who lived during World War II and after, and he illuminated. I encourage you to look him up, because he made some absolutely breathtaking illustrations. But his Haggadah was very much in the post World War II era. So you see a lot of Nazi references in what the Egyptians are doing as well. It's pretty haunting. There are some Haggadot in the present day as well that have references to the Holocaust. There are a number of different Holocaust Haggadot that were made by artists, not just created in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, where all of the imagery shows the same words that are in the Haggadah applying to the atrocities of World War II, sometimes in incredibly powerful ways. And you can check out the Kveler Haggadah as well, when the link is there in the chat. Someone asked for the citation to the section of the Mishnah. I believe it's Pesachim 10, chapter 10 of Pesachim. Yes, Arthur Schick's story is amazing and highly recommended if you want to learn a tremendous amount. There's a whole website dedicated to his work. I don't have it offhand, but I think if you Google Arthur Schick, it'll probably be the first result that comes up. So there's a lot. What else? I'm not sure. I assume that's a typo. Songs, yeah. Dayenu, maybe? The question is, was something and other songs part of the seders in a certain time period? So yeah, Dayenu was in the seder. What does not appear in older Haggadot is most of the songs from Nirza. So the songs at the very end of the seder, which are also distinct Sephardic and Ashkenazic, they're different. But it often ends, the older Haggadot often ends with the Hallel. But yes, Dayenu and most of the songs from the main part of the Seder actually do appear there. There, Schick's Haggadah is available on Amazon. I should note that there are two versions of Schick's Haggadah. One was produced as an exclusive copy, I think in 300, and an edition of 300 on vellum. That one is quite a lot more expensive than the copy, but you can also find a regular copy for the average person, as one might say, that you can find as well. And also, if you give, I hope the link to Ktiv went into the chat, because this is out of the National Library of Israel. It's a database of digitized manuscripts, and if you search for Haggadah, and you can limit by digitized, so you could limit to what's been digitized already. You can see just one after another Haggadot from across time. And these are only manuscripts, so these are only handwritten. That doesn't include the printed ones, of which there's also a wonderful collection. And I believe it was the Open Sidor project that produced a collection. I'll have to find it, maybe I'll send it afterwards. There was a collection of Haggadot, images from Haggadot that you could use to make your own Haggadah, that was put together for COVID, because a lot of people were doing their Seder on Zoom, so that you could grab the images and put them into your Haggadah. So you could use any of the images that we saw today as part of what was shown on the screen during the Zoom Seder in the last couple of years. Haggadot created in concentration camps. I don't know any offhand, but I am sure that there were those that were created. Probably there, I would look at a place like the Holocaust Museum or Yad Vashem, because I literally have no doubt that there's at least one that was produced during World War II. That would not surprise me at all. And then also there's a whole genre of Haggadot that are not the traditional text, of course. And you have the Kibbutz Haggadah, and you have people get so creative. All sorts of different Haggadot celebrating different kinds of liberation, celebrating different experiences, all sorts of different things, which is really a genre unto itself of sort of additional Haggadot. I've seen parody Haggadot where it's representing something that happened, not as much as we have with the Megillah, where there are Megillot. copying the book of Esther to tell a story of a salvation that happened to a particular community. But I've seen at least one Haggadah that was copying the Haggadah, but it wasn't actually the Haggadah text. It was written as a satire. And that was maybe 18th century, I want to say. Ruth Weisberg is amazing. Yes. Can I talk about Haggadah? It's so weird. Yeah, it's wacky. But ultimately, it's this story of salvation, and that's what it's going down to. It's this story of, of constant oppression, and then it has to stop. And like the buck stops at God, and so God destroys all of those. So in a way, it follows that that pattern. I can't say too much about it. It's not my expertise, but I think there's a lot out there that talks about Haggadah. I did not know that, Janet Weinberg. Thank you for saying that. That's where that was the origin of the Maxwell Haggadah, was that people didn't believe that it was kosher for Passover, that coffee was kosher for Passover. So Maxwell House wanted to put out a Haggadah to encourage people, because of course beans are kitniot, but coffee beans are not, thankfully, because I don't think a lot of us would survive the Passover Seder without coffee beans. There are a lot of objects. Somebody mentioned that their local museum has matzah holders made out of silver that tell the story of the Exodus, with people carrying the Seder plate foods. It's not my expertise. I'm a librarian. I work with books. I'm not a museum curator, but there are some amazing objects connected to the Passover Seder, especially the Seder plate. That's one of the first things you'll see. But all different, decorated, like you said, where sometimes people are holding up the various plates for the Seder, or matzah holders. Some really interesting contemporary ones as well. I just saw a beautiful Haggadah in the shape of a bowl, where the entire text of the Haggadah is on the bowl itself. So it's not functionally very usable. It's an art piece, and then you open it up, and inside is a plate for the matzah and a Seder plate. So it has the entire text on the circular image. And then inside are sort of usable objects to go with it. Let's see. Refusnik Haggadah, compiled in the 70s, saved by fire, Mutzal Mi'ish, a Grateful Dead Seder Haggadah. That sounds pretty cool as well. And I think people make their own. What I love about some of the Haggadot that I showed, and especially the dirty ones, is that the Haggadah is something that I think, unlike something like the Bible text or a Torah, which has sort of a sacredness that you don't mess with it, the Haggadah is something that people are able to personalize and make their own, and drop food on it and spill wine on it and, doodle on it. And you see all sorts of stuff like that. I mean, the fact that a censor could pick up the Sarajevo Haggadah, which was incredibly beautiful, and then sign it at the end, like, no, there's nothing heretical in here, according to the Catholic Church, hurts me. But at the same time, you have the owner's inscriptions, people signing it, that Judeo-Arabic one where the owner was like, anybody who steals this should be cursed, that it's mine, I'm making it, and this is something I can turn into my own. My Passover experience is both, national in a way, but also personal. And I think the way that people personalize it is really absolutely incredible. I love that idea that everybody at the Seder signs the inside cover for Jody's friend. So you have a whole list of who experienced that Seder with you every year. That's fabulous. Go to Jody's Seder and sign her Haggadah. All right. So are we? I think we're all set. It looks like it's quieted down. Thank Thank you all for joining. Thanks for the great questions and great comments. I learned a lot. There's a Seinfeld Haggadah, there's a Harry Potter Haggadah, there's a very long list of contemporary pop culture Haggadot as well. So thank you, everybody. I don't know if you're going to close out, or how does that work?
Sure. No, that's fine. I can do that. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this My Jewish Learning class with Michelle Chesner. This was amazing. There will be info sent out in a follow-up email with a link to the recording of this event, as well as all the amazing links that Michelle has given us. So thank you so much, and everyone have a wonderful afternoon.
And enjoy your Passover. Thank you.